That was that's right. So quality, except for one panelist, seems to be the seems to be job one in talking about RTB. It's a topic that's come up throughout today, which I'm happy to hear. But there are a lot of different ways to come at it. If we really are going to get RTB out of its reputation for being bargain basement inventory of last resort, then luring better and better inventory takes a lot of different dimensions, and getting the quality better, getting quality impressions better for everyone throughout is a complex process that involves a number of bits and pieces that I was trying to bring together in this panel. Obviously, there are a number of hurdles. We've heard some of them already today. The complexity thing, of course, is still always there. Maybe always will be there, but the need for the math degree to understand how this stuff works is still a hurdle, both for some within some agencies, but also for a lot of brands. But one important piece of that complexity piece, especially for publishers, is also the layers of complexity that add cost, and whether publishers on their end are really realizing from the CPMs they see in this system the kind of money that they really need to be invested in it. But then there's also the promise of viewability and the viewable impression, which we've heard mentioned throughout the day, and of course is one of the key themes throughout display advertising this year, and whether the viewable impression will create a situation of scarcity that helps raise the value of the inventory, but also help raise the relative quality of inventory in the RTB system. To take up this sort of cluster of ideas and taking the lead on this panel, we have James Green, who's the CEO of Magnetic, a company that does a lot of buying within the RTB system. It's a search retargeting company. James has a long career in marketing, having served as the general manager of the Japanese market for the Walt Disney Company, and also eventually as VP of marketing at Pixar under Steve Jobs. CEO of a number of digital companies over the last decade, including Sabala, Giant Bear, and Giant Realm. Please welcome James Green.
Thank you very much. So as it's getting a little late in the day, I want to do something a little differently to try to keep you all engaged with us. We've broken the panel into a few topics. They are quality, viewable impressions, data that drives all of the buying, and then a general discussion about RTB. And after each of those sections, I'm going to open it up for questions, so that you can ask questions about what we're talking about instead of waiting all the way to the end. Radical idea. Introduce our panelists, Rob Griffin, who you've already welcomed and then asked to leave, which is, the latter was probably the better response. He's an insane skier and has been at Havas for longer than he probably should have, but has an awesome job there running product. Welcome. You want to say a couple of words about what you do?
I'm a parachuting paramedic. I help win business, fix client problems.
There you go. One of three agency people we have, and comes to us from, actually she's been in this RTB targeting space for a long time, AOL, Dakota, 24/7, even back in the little old ad server, Real Media, before it was part of 24/7, and now at ComScore, so brings the research part. You want to talk to us a little bit about what you do there?
Sure. I manage the advertising effectiveness and advertising evaluation product suite, so helping figure out the quality.
John, Omnicom representative right here on the panel. You want to talk to us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So I work for Acumen, which is Omnicom's trading desk. I oversee the buys on the East Coast, work to kind of educate a lot of the media teams as well as some of the clients directly, and just kind of on the same parachuting, paramedic kind of lines. I'm in that business as well, too.
Excellent. And my favorite person on the panel, because we all talk about these subjects and we sort of dance around them, and we have a dance instructor on the panel. Joel?
So I teach dance, and then on nights and weekends I do digital marketing.
Which is kind of awesome. And it's on LinkedIn. You can go check it out. So he's at Critical Mass, and I hope you can throw in lots of allegories about the comparisons. And finally, we have Eric, who is, I think you're running 2 companies on the side while you work for Rocket Fuel, is that right?
No, don't tell our investors that. Yeah, no,
it is on LinkedIn. So.
Chief Marketing Officer of Rocket Fuel, machine learning, big data equals what we do. And yes, on the side, I have 3 children that are in, well, at this point now, 2 schools instead of 3 schools. So I started a little side business called Classy List, call it Salesforce for Parents. You can download the app; it's free, and it's as my grandmother says, it's a mitzvah that I'm doing because it doesn't actually cost anything, and it's costing me a lot. So
there you go.
So
and of course, you come from a little bit of the client side in your background, so
yes, I come from your world. For those of you who are on the agency side, I built an agency over the course of 7 years in 2002, 2009. So I've been in those shoes too, and I think actually have either worked with or been on panels with most, if not everybody, represented here. So
there we go. So that's who we got. That's who we got on the panel. Oh, look at this! Thank you. Nice. All right.
Too bad. Yours just went down the back.
You can give him mine. All right. So let's start off with our first question. You can be a free-for-all. Do you control media placement in an RTB or not? And once you're buying in RTB, does media placement make much of a difference, or is it just the data?
From the agency perspective, so critical mass, we're full service digital, and I run the media team as well as teaching them how to dance. And for us, ultimately, because of the pressures of working in a digital agency, ultimately for us, the answer is no. Our KPIs are hitting client KPIs, and do I really care, as long as it's not on offensive content, what specific content an advertisement runs against? Probably not, to be perfectly honest. And that might not sound great, but it's true. And my client doesn't care either. And we have done a good enough job educating them to say, hey, we don't care if it's on home shelter content or sports content or financial content, as long as we're nailing our KPIs. And so do I control it? No. I leave it up to this fine gentleman and this fine gentleman and the rest of those bidding tools.
Anyone have a contrary opinion?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to take the polar opposite of that.
Nice,
I think
thank you, Rob.
That's, yeah, you know me, I'm never shy of an opinion.
You're crazy.
I think, to me, I think what you were just describing is sort of, unfortunately, the current state of the RTB space and what most trading desks are doing, which is essentially the dirty word in the conversation that nobody wants to have, is I'm taking publicly available data, publicly available inventory, and I'm arbitraging it. And I'm not really doing anything exciting. I think the future of the space is when everybody in the industry wants to talk about the digitization of traditional media. Nobody wants to talk about the traditionalization of digital. And in that context, I think the context of that placement and the publisher I'm working with is paramount. And I think the future of the space is using the DSP technology as a workflow tool and a paperless I/O. And even when I do my upfront buys, it's going to be a trading desk-like team that's going to execute that. Now, I'm not using the DSP to buy based on price in that scenario, but if I'm buying ESPN because they have 75% of my target audience, I don't want that 25% waste. So I'm going to do the deal with ESPN and say, I'm going to give you the $4 million. However, on an impression-by-impression basis, I'm going to pick the user, and I want to place those ads in very, very specific places on that website. In this whole world, especially with earned and owned media and all this sort of stuff, content is king, right? You got advertisers, everybody talks about it, and it's sort of a cliche at this point, but the advertiser has to act like a publisher and produce relevant content. Well, if you want to do that well, the message and the offer and the context of that placement is absolutely paramount and mission critical. And one brand I think that does really, really well in this sort of evolved sort of everything's social, everything's mobile, everything's digital sort of world is Nike Plus. If you look at most of their advertising, they're not selling me sneakers. They're selling me the opportunity to be a better runner. And they're giving me a community to talk about other runners that I can share tips and advice and be a better runner. And along the way, I'm going to buy some Nike products. And as an organization, they don't make their own shoes, they don't ship their own shoes, they don't own their own store, they're a marketing and strategy team. And in that world, I think the placement and the context and the quality is absolutely critical. Now, I agree with what you were talking about in that that'll always exist for the Vonages of the world, right? Lester Wonderman proved 30 years ago that direct mail, yeah, there's a shitload of waste. However, if I buy it at the right price, the sales I do get is highly profitable, unsexy, but it works. And that's why agencies have created DRTV shops, and that's how they roll. And in the modern digital vernacular, the trading desk often, to me, represents the spot buying team, right? It's non-guaranteed inventory. I'm buying under CPM, and I'm billing my client under CPM. The modern day digital performance agency is oftentimes a DRTV shop where I'm buying it under CPM, and I'm getting paid on some other metric. share of sales, cost per lead. And so for those guys, that inventory absolutely doesn't matter. For everybody else, that context of that placement is mission critical.
So, as I say, what it sounds like you're getting at is there are no bad impressions or placements. There are only bad valuations, and you value context very, very highly, and you're willing to pay for it up front and lock it in, or to pay a higher rate on the RTB platform.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the whole RTB space is going to evolve. I mean, look at eBay, right? Just from a consumer perspective, never mind B2B, like is sort of what we're talking about here. You know, the evolution of the buy now button on eBay. That's sort of what we're talking about here, right? Like, all right, I might overpay on this, but I want to lock it down. I have to have this.
Yeah, but I actually think there are bad placements, and there are things that are not worth anybody spending money on. There's not a lot of them. I mean, that's the good news. They're few, but they can be voluminous. So a few bad placements running either technology scams or running just inappropriate content can generate a massive amount of impressions.
I would say the scams are bad. I would argue on inappropriate content because that inappropriate is valuable to a consumer somewhere. And how you define inappropriate varies by brand, and some brand wants to be in front of that person that likes inappropriate stuff.
There are some stuff that very few brands would value.
But it's valuable to somebody.
It,
Scammy stuff, I agree.
I hope
I'll
none of them
defend
are on
the
this panel.
inappropriate content.
I was always confident you would.
I mean, at the end of the day, let's be frank, right? Porn, right? It's bad, inappropriate technically, yet they're the pioneers of everything we do in this industry. They used search syndication before we even knew what search syndication was. They used retargeting before we knew what retargeting was. I mean...
But there are brands
Just
where
don't
it's
talk
not
about
appropriate.
immersive experiences.
There's hate speech. There are some things that it's just not good inventory for the brands, or at least the companies that we're doing business with in this room. And it exists, and the problem is that not that it exists a ton, although in other markets, in Japan, for example, the percentage is a lot higher. But in the US, it's not a big deal as a volume issue in terms of there's not a lot of sites that are trying to put it out there. It's that they technologically can generate a hell of a lot of impressions and put that inventory into exchanges.
But even the publishers, right? Like I was part of like the 4A's group talking about sort of this space, and a lot of the premium publishers are like, I don't need this. I don't like ad verification, for example. And and from the agency side, if you look at data, we have our own sort of database. We take all the ad serving data out of that system, and we can do some funky analysis at a unique transaction level and get a lot of insight. But you work for a pharmaceutical and you do a buy for a drug that's U.S. only. WebMD can't physically ensure to me that that ad is not seen outside the United States. You get an iframe and an iframe and an iframe. Somebody spoofs their browser so they can access U.S. content outside of the United States. But they're now legally liable if that ad is shown outside. So therefore, I want to use a DSP type like technology and have an ad server with delivery verification on top of that, right? So I can say, no, I don't want that. Now, as an agency, if that ad call is coming into me, I might say no for Mr. Pharmaceutical client. No, I'm not going to serve an ad to that impression. However, this other direct response guy over here, Vonage, yeah, he'll take it, right? And so that's why I think the context of that sort of varies wildly.
So two subjects that came out of this is, one, you talked about big brands, using a DSP or real-time bidding to buy on ESPN. Are we seeing a lot of those big brands in RTB now? Are you able to do that, or is that still, private one-to-one transactions, even if they are RTB? Can you go to a regular exchange and find those big brand publishers?
Absolutely. I think at this point it's not a question of who is there, it's a question of who isn't there. And certainly, for those of you who didn't read it, and it was in another publication, but I won't name the publication out of respect for MediaPost, but Meredith Levien, who is the CRO of Forbes, wrote a great piece at the end of last year about how RTB is actually a great enabler of her direct sales force. So we talk about, there are certain instances where we talk about cannibalization from a publisher's perspective. She sees it as a tremendous opportunity because the value generated from, and it's not just her, but she's been one of the brave publisher brands that's been most vocal about this. She sees value in arming. It's just as we would arm advertisers with insights, they're using RTB as a mechanism by which they can arm their sales force with insights about how to upsell more integrated programs, right? Because Forbes isn't just a publisher brand. Forbes is a publisher brand, it's an insights brand, it's an events brand. They're all the pieces that are wrapped around that. So I love to see the future. And again, we have there are other publishers, right? So Microsoft offloads some of its inventory to AppNexus. Yahoo offloads some of its inventory to RMX. So it's no secret that publishers are out there. I think the difference now, though, is that because we have this, call it a hyper hyperfragmentation of attention, there are too many sites, too many opportunities for buying teams, for human manipulation, for human planning to take place. And of course, that's a bit of a, it's not an advertisement, but the point is that machines do a much better job in many of these instances. And so let the machines do the heavy lifting of planning and optimization. And then if the machine is smart enough to return insights to you as an agency person, as an advertiser, then I believe agencies get to do inspiring and liberating work. They get to be storytellers, they get to be narrators, they get to create stories again and not have to deal in the minutia.
But the machine's only as good as the person driving it. You can give anybody in this room a Formula One car and they're not going to win a race.
But let's see, Curiosity landed on the moon, on Mars by itself. So I think that there's a difference in terms of understanding.
But the algorithm that got it there was built by a person.
Right, but the person doesn't need to sit there and watch the algorithm drive its way to Mars. So
15
yes,
15 all, 30, 15. So let's move a little beyond that, because I know this could go on forever.
It's like driving a Ferrari in a sandpit. It's like
I'm just glad that Eric and Rob are opposite ends of the panel, or it really would go on forever. We've established that everyone's buying on RTB and everyone is available on RTB. Some people don't care where it runs because they're a la Vonage, and some people care a great deal where it runs. But how do you make sure that you're, if you're an agency or a brand and you're buying in RTB, how do you make sure that you're not a victim of truly the evil, the spam, the bots, the stuff that no one, that's just misrepresenting itself?
Well, I think that, to Eric's point, technology is great to be optimizing to a conversion or whatever, metric you're looking to hit, but I think that's where technology falls short, right? There's only so much you can do. The internet is constantly growing. The way that ads are being served are constantly growing. The technology is changing all the time. Without that person behind that technology that's maybe trying to stop that spam bot that's coming through, or without that team that's looking into the account or into the DSP every day, really taking a look at that placement, that creative, and saying, hey, wow, we just blew through 10,000 impressions in 30 seconds. There's obviously something wrong here. I think it's a combination of both for sure, but to sit back and say, hey, I got it, I've integrated X, Y, and Z into my technology stack, and this DSP reorged their entire tiered structure for inventory, I think that would be, short-sighted.
well,
And the people that are generating that inventory are using a combination of both. They're using really good people that are going out and looking for holes in how good sites even, and sometimes this stuff is not necessarily caused by bad sites. Sometimes it's actually done to good sites, done and imposed upon them without their knowledge. So there are humans that are going out and coming up with strategies to develop this kind of inventory, put it into the exchanges, and then they're really using technology to increase volume. And they've taken those two strategies.
So that's a great point.
And
So
that's what you need to combat
Right,
it.
so you're, just to be clear, you're saying, you're just as likely to be a victim of fraud or spam or whatever on a big branded site as you are on a long tail site.
Not just as likely. There's certainly other sites,
Right.
percentage-wise would be higher, but it does happen.
Right.
Great name sites that have nothing to do with it.
Right.
And they get victimized by it.
Now, to me, whether, and I agree on that, I think there's varying degrees of risk that just exist no matter what. I think you're spot on. And to what Eric and I are going back at, regardless of what the ratio of person versus technology, to me, to your question, which was how do you make that bad stuff go away, it's less to me about the inventory, and I think it's about evolution in the marketplace and an evolution and a granularity in our definition of a DMP. I think, I was talking about some of this earlier, but to be a geek and use a Lord of the Rings analogy, where the market's evolving to is I need one DMP to rule them all. Right? They're all DMPs. We have Artemis at Havas, and it's a DMP. But all I'm doing is taking ad serving data and doing some analysis on that. BlueKai is generic third-party data, and whether you think it's good data or bad data, it's technically a DMP. But if you look at what AdNexus is trying to do as an independent pure play, my DMP is not tied to an inventory source or a data source. If you look at what P&G made Audience Science do, if you look at what Amex is making DataZoo do, if you look at Lotamade divesting their network side of their business, I need one DMP where I can feed my paid media data into that system and compare it against the client's first-party CRM data. And maybe I do want third-party BlueKai data, but I need somebody that's independent of all that and then I can start making sure and making that bad stuff go away. Whether it's RTB bought or it's just bought through a buying team, I've now got a universal platform so I can see a more holistic view of my data and what I'm doing, so I can then buy smarter, whether it's a machine doing it or a person doing it at that point, or whether I'm trying to get rid of bad inventory or spam or impressions I didn't want to buy. If you don't have that universal system in place, you're still looking at everything in sort of little pockets and silos.
Well, and I think to that point, so when you talk about pockets and silos, it's a little bit like looking at Dell, the way they build computers, versus Apple. So I think there are two schools of thought there. One is, can you build your own stack? Can you build your own stack? Can you tie, and do you have the right millisecond, microsecond view between transactions that are going into one database, going into Hadoop, coming out through Hive, through a query, going into somebody else's? Do you have the right server-to-server integrations, what have you? And so there are a set of companies that are building those. You can have your app stack in that way, and then there are another set of companies that are saying, well, we can build it from the top down. And there's certain performance efficiencies, and certainly Apple has seen this in terms of how it builds its processors, how it builds the physical chassis to support its devices to do that. So I do agree with you that that DMP is important. It's one piece of it. It's certainly not the only element. And so for anybody out there who's thinking about, well, do I have a DMP on my own? Make sure you're sitting hand in hand with your CIO or your CTO or a technical advisor, because it's not as simple as let me plug in a DMP or let me plug it out. You need to really think very carefully about holistic top-down stack versus a sandwich from different components.
Couple of things into one question, and then we'll go to the audience, see if you have any other questions on this quality section, which is moving beyond just banners. So great, you can do banners. What about expandables? What about video? What about skins? What about other kinds of things? Are these now working uniformly? I mean, I know you can buy them and you can put a backup, but are they really working and as they would on a straight buy? And what about expanding into social? And is Facebook Exchange making any difference there? So that's all about moving beyond just this typical display.
Absolutely. I think rich media for us and our clients is huge. And just like if I bought a direct buy on a site with a normal banner versus rich media, our returns are incrementally higher with rich media. And of course, the real-time bidding landscape, it takes it incrementally further, obviously, because not only do I have all of the media capabilities that I can start to optimize, but once I start serving dynamic content into an ad, or once I start having all sorts of content that can come through an expandable or video, or whatever it is, you exponentially increase the amount of optimization points and can optimize that much further.
I think I'd also say that, it's growing. I agree with you there. But the other piece to it is all the data that's coming from these programmatic buys are informing all of those custom buys that still exist. I think we'd all agree that RTB isn't a magic bullet, right? They're definitely, it's continuing to grow. It's still there. I'm not deterring anyone from, looking for those more customized RTB buys, but all the data that's coming out of even just the straight display buys, the FBX that's, kind of coming up, that's an amazing source of information that's still yet to be untapped. There's so much that can be translated back to those teams that are still purchasing the custom skins, that are working and putting together the roadblocks that maybe are never going to show up in an exchange. And I still think that information pass has to be refined in the agency world. I don't think we've done everything we can to really pass that information off, and I think it comes back to the DMP as well and leveraging that better. But I just want to make sure that even though the high-end custom stuff may not be in the RTB space, RTB information and data is critical to informing and being efficient in making those custom buys.
Yeah, I think it does vary to some degree because, to me, the rich media and the sort of the custom placements, I was meeting with the guys yesterday from Beanstalk in terms of what they're trying to do is sort of aggregating premium inventory and sort of custom sort of placements, and not even just rich media, but using sort of DSP-like technology to make it easier to buy. That's really where the sexy part is in a lot of this. But still, as an agency, we still have a lot of advertisers that paying extra for premium and inventory and rich media and fancy targeting just doesn't work. It just goes back to direct response advertising that I just need tonnage at a certain price, and my conversion's my conversion, no matter how fancy I get. And that's a very unsexy side of it, but it's the reality. And so I think the sexy side of it is what I want to focus on, and it's what I like to talk about. And there are companies doing it, and I think we could do, as an industry, a better job of it. Yet that's still just the little itty-bitty tip of the iceberg that sticks above the water. And the reality is a lot of our business is driven by that unsexy part that sits under the water that's massive.
Well, and so here's an unsexy insight. For anybody that's been in this business for 10 years, you remember what the IAB did, 10 years ago, what Jonathan Adams did, 4As. Hey, what you should do is you should put your logo in the first frame and keep it in every frame. Like some simple stuff that I think a lot of creative folks, somehow it's been ignored, it's been put on the back shelf. And so what we find for some of our clients, again, in the action, the KPI could be a lift in brand preference. So if we had integration with a brand study through DimeStore, or the KPI could be a conversion. And we find that when if the algorithm says, or if the algorithms say, you know what, let's actually try the static unit, because the static unit has the call to action, the logo in the actual brand logo itself, we find that volume of advertising actually yields a better return for the advertiser. And it's not a function of cost. It's not a function of cost of the placement. It's literally a function of creative teams have forgotten some of the basic tried and true methods that have been established for 10 years about how do you build a great creative. And so again, in this hyper attention deficit disorder economy that we live in, especially as it relates to browsing the web, how many browsers do you have open at a given period of time? How many times are you scrolling up and down? Human behavior has changed. Human behavior has changed where it's not just a lean back, it's very much a lean forward and lean across and move on to tablet and what have you. And so you have to remember, like, okay, get the logo right. Don't make it happen within 5 seconds into the ad, because somebody may not be on that page. People are scanning now. They're not reading, they're scanning. So you need to make sure that some of those very tried and true creative precepts are embedded into whatever creative you reproduce.
And I think to bring the sexy into the unsexy in that scenario, that's where I think was really exciting, not necessarily about RTB itself, but the ability to pick and choose when I'm going to serve up that sort of non-sexy ad, because I can make sure it's in front of the right person, right? And that's why I think it's really, really cool that you can sort of dynamically start to fine-tune the messaging that's going in front of that user. If you even look at like Cognitive Match or some of these guys, what they're doing in terms of having sort of predictive modeling algorithms to ensure that I'm assembling the right landing page in front of the right user, that you got 5 people that want the same offer, but depending on the hero image, the color, the graphic, where the click button is to buy will vary by person. So it doesn't necessarily have to be sexy or not, but I got to dynamically ensure that I have the right context to the right user. And that's something that's very, very cool that this space offers, whether it's an RTB purchase buy or not.
No, and I think definitely what Ann, and this is not necessarily a plug for ComScore, but so you've run the 4,000th at this point VCE campaign. That was just some news that came out this week or last week. So it's not just a function of viewability; it's also a function of viewability, plus time equals those pockets of opportunity where you can say, hey, you know what? I actually have the time. I actually have the attention of an audience, and that gets to premium publisher. You may be actually spending a little bit more time with that content. What time of day? Hey, if you're in the middle of your office day and this is someone who's clearly at work, they're scanning, they're not actually reading. So all of these different factors can be applied, either the heuristics around the algorithmic placement of it, or through less efficient but human tactics.
See, it's good we're not sitting together, because now I'd hug them.
So
we're not done yet.
That's a natural segue into the next section, which is viewability. Anyone in the audience have any questions about the quality of RTB that we've been discussing up here at the moment? Questions out there?
All right, show of hands. Who thinks quality? Who thinks there's actual quality in RTB? Don't be shy. On right, who doesn't think there's quality in RTB? All right, and then there are a bunch of people who are maybe on their computers, exactly, on their computers and don't actually know. Well, I mean, so that's good, though.
That is very good.
I think in the sense that as we have
it's
agency
good because
people,
they agree with
publishers,
you when you said that there's high-quality publishers, so it's very good.
Well, I appreciate that.
So let's move on to viewability, and we had a discussion beforehand about some of the less obvious implications of non-viewable impressions.
Sure. So it's come up already. If as long as I'm getting what I expect in RTB, be that a conversion or even brand lift, then it doesn't matter necessarily whether it's associated with a brand. In some cases it does. It matters whether it's associated with the content, and the content's good. The fundamental precept of that, though, is that you're getting what you expect in terms of that KPI. And the reality is, what viewability has taught us is that that may not be true. So ads that are not viewable still set exposure pixels. It's like a basic technology issue in our business. If an ad sets an exposure pixel and then no one sees that ad, and they take a survey asking about brand lift, or they buy a product and convert, all the attribution systems, whether it's last click or whether it's last view or a whole complicated attribution system, they all think that that ad had some impact on that end KPI. And one of the things that we see in RTB is that those placements that you can buy really, really cheap give you really big reach. And that means that there's a heck of a lot of those exposure pixels distributed. If those placements are so cheap because they're 95, they're the 95th ad down at the bottom of the page and no one ever sees it, that buy still shows up and looks like it had some business value. It looks like it made conversions. It looks like it made brand lift. When in fact the lift, the conversions, actually were driven by that really great integrated placement or by another RTB buy. But the cheapest way, the best way to get a really high conversion is to buy the cheapest inventory possible and spread a lot of pixels out. And that's one of the reasons why viewables become so important in this space, because the supply of pixels that no one sees is infinite. You can continue to put them at the bottom of the page forever. But to create really quality and be able to buy in this space, you have to know that I'm only counting something as having caused conversion, caused a brand lift, because it was seen. And that's where viewability makes such a difference.
I agree, the viewability part's important, but I think for a lot of advertisers, like, again, sort of history repeats itself. If you look about the scalability, some cases I just need to factor into my cost that there's going to be a degree of waste and it's there. Right, and in that context,
know how much.
Well, if you pixel everywhere and for a certain advertiser, and there's a ton of that, that goes back to my comment about having the one sort of universal DMP, because at that point, if I have pixels everywhere, I'm going to have a certain network or a certain placement that's going to seemingly be taking credit for everything. Now, there might be that waste there, and I'm okay with that, but if I don't have one system that's overlooking all of that, I'm not going to be able to differentiate between my partners that have pixeled 90% of the internet.
Yeah, we'd advocate for one system, independent.
But I think one of the interesting points that Anne makes is that those pixels are hurting a lot of publishers because of the pricing. Because if you're right and there's so many unviewable impressions and they are sold for cheap, then it's much harder to price higher for the rest, right?
That's right. And it's really, it hurts agencies and it hurts publishers, because an agency coming in thinks that something looks like a really good deal. The conversion data tells it was a good deal, says it's worth buying at this rate. And so they're going to put more money toward that instance. But in reality, that's not actually what's driving the end business goal. And for most of our clients, the end business goal is actually making money. There's a revenue goal. So they want to sell a product offline or they want to sell a product online, but ultimately it's about increasing their bottom line. The CMO who's investing in this ad campaign is doing it because the CEO says we need to grow our business. So if they are the agency putting money in and it appears to be working but actually isn't, that's hurting the agency. It's hurting the marketer. And it hurts the publisher, because the publisher who is providing good inventory in looks like it's not performing as well as the one that's putting in the garbage.
So, and you've done 4,000 of these. What percentage of, at this point, from the ComScore point of view, now granted, now some other things to know about viewability, right? So MRC hasn't actually made their final recommendation on this. There are two big browsers that you can't do anything with regard to viewability yet. So it's sort of like half of my ads are potentially viewable. I'd at least know which half on the basis of browser. So just be cognizant of the fact that we'd be looking at the MRC in addition to anything that we might say on the panel in terms of what their final recommendation is. But with that said, I am curious. 4,000 campaigns, gajillion impressions. What percentage is viewable on average?
It varies depending on the placement type.
On average?
It does, but you have to recognize it really does vary.
Let's
on the
make this
placement
more
type.
interesting. Let's
So
go and have
premium
everyone
publishers-
answer that question. So
Okay.
you can go first, and then we'll have everyone
Premium publishers,
answer.
you're going to see maybe 60%, 70%. If you're looking at some non-premium, sort of undifferentiated content, you're probably looking closer to 40 to 50 in general.
And Rob, what do you see?
I would argue, I would take an extreme point of view, and I'd say on the premium inventory, when I'm working with that publisher, sort of we're working with our creative partners and working with that publisher, and you're sort of aligning not just the publisher because he has the right composition of my target audience, but he has the right content that fits with the content my brand's trying to do in terms of the brand being more meaningful and focusing on the consumer outcome at that point. So I would argue in that instance, I would say it's even much higher than that 60%, but I would be more cynical on the non-guaranteed, non-premium to say that it's probably much closer to an 80-20 rule, and I'm going to say something like 80% plus is not viewable.
There are pockets where it's 5%. But in general, I mean, most people are in this business are trying to do the right thing. The problem is that there's just a few, but they can generate a lot of inventory, and it depresses the accuracy and the rates for
We're still talking about averages. So yeah, John,
let me ask this question too, because I think in the end, you touched on it a little bit. It's really a technology issue, right? The iframe is what's causing the problem that's not allowing us to see it. So I think in the end, what you're looking at is, and even the IAB, when they're going to announce probably soon about a lot of the onus is going to be on the publisher side to be able to change the way they're physically serving the ad. And I think what that's going to do is you're going to find publishers who are shooting for ways to serve more viewable impressions. That could mean anything from kind of what you're seeing the ESPNs of the world do, looking at a Twitter model for serving ads, or even some of the major publishers kind of taking that first step into creating the feed of ads, right? And when you do that, you're going to have a space that's full of viewable impressions where it wasn't before. And you're still going to have the same issue to solve, which is how do you find that right person in the right moment for the cheapest cost? And this is a question that's coming back and forth to each advertiser. And look, viewability is definitely an issue. But when it comes to investing in the technology stack to solve it and really put dollars towards being able to figure it out, I think a lot of advertisers are netting out on the side of, well, you know, my resources and my technology are better used to be smarter about collecting information regarding to targeting that person as compared to let's try and solve this issue short term and really, you know, figure this out and then go on to the next huge problem that we need to solve.
So I'm going to cut
the marketers need to do
I'm going
the
to cut you
technology.
off, Ann. We have 5 minutes left, and there's one big topic which we haven't even touched on yet, right? So if you're buying in RTB...
Was that the topic of how great Magnetic is?
Oh, thank you so much. I do love that, even though I don't have a water. The final topic is if you're buying in RTB, you better have some data to drive the buy. Like, otherwise, why are you there in the first place? So what about the quality of that data in the first place? Like, I've heard stories of, you know, middle-aged guy is categorized as a young woman, in a database. That doesn't really work. So, what do you do about making sure that, and the beginning of it's easy, right? So if you start out by doing site retargeting as an example, you're pretty confident that data is right. The person visited your site, you're going to retarget them. But as soon as you go beyond that, you're going to rely on some other kind of third party. How do you know that the data is right?
Well, knowing that the data is right is crucially important. And I was talking to someone a couple weeks ago, and he told me an anecdote about they geo-targeted using DataLogic's data, which is registration and login data supplied, and then they had double verify, which is IP address data for geo-targeting. And then there were 2 weeks of screaming matches because that data did not match up at all. Not because either system was wrong, but just because they recorded the data differently. And so I think at the point of talking about data, you can get away, as Rob was talking about, you can wallpaper the world and still have some success based on your KPIs. But if you are going to use data, you have to make sure that the systems you're using, again, to the centralized system, are recording it and thinking about it the same way, or else it's never going to match up and your head is going to explode, and then it's a mess.
Well, and I think along those lines, you just got to accept that all the third-party data providers all have crap in there. Yeah. There's nothing you can do
risk
about
no matter what.
Oh, it's the nature of the business. What you got to know is for each advertiser you work with, whose crap is more valuable to which of my advertisers, and who has less crap. Right? And at the end of the day, what I always like to say, especially in this world, everybody wants to say big data. And if I get one more sort of spam email that says big data in the subject, I might puke on myself.
Just for the record, you're the only person to say big data on this panel.
It is, yeah. So. But you know what? It's not how big my data is. It's how well I use it.
It's small, but it's fierce.
Thanks for the setup there.
You're welcome.
I'm throwing the waka 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 now.
But even the question of when, right? I think to your point, we all agree with that. There's going to be some sort of vetting you have to do with any data partner you choose. But a lot of times we see advertisers that say, we know our business, we know who this person is, guaranteed, let's invest in them right now, let's go out and buy this segment. Well, when we run an RTB buy on top of that and really pull in some of the data, we oftentimes find either A, there's segments that exist that you could have bought for half the price of the segment that you bought to start with, or maybe something completely opposite of that. So really having a strong identity for who your audience is and really making a data decision around it too, and not just say, hey, we've got great panel data, we've got great survey data, not that that's not worth its salt, but to dig in and make sure that your investment is worth the time. I see a lot of advertisers, it's something we try to get through very often on our side.
Don't underestimate the value of a great panel.
Hey. But don't.
Yes.
Well,
I like
my
that one.
recommendation there would be don't rely on one data partner. So quote unquote, there is somebody in this room maybe will take this business idea and run, but nobody has yet come up with any sort of way in which, like the MRC or the ARF, has said, okay, here's the way in which we quantify the way in which a segment has been generated. Because
you could get a ComScore report. And
you can get no one has yet done this across all of the data companies that exist, whether it be panel, and there's some instances of you could talk about ComScore's methodology about panel. Point being that don't rely on one. If you do rely on one, you're setting yourself up for disaster. If you can, to the point of how big is your data? I'm not going to respond to you, at least not on the panel. But if you can, you should use all of it, because each data point, again, this notion of hyperfragmentation. One example. So in our model, we'll have 11 million features, data features that we might use, upon which about 60,000 of them will run at runtime to make a bid decision. That's not tied to any one single data source. The data source could be National Weather Service. Data source could be time of day. Data source could be geography. Data source could be any one of, I won't list all 11 million, but that's the key. And I think, provided that you don't overly ascribe value to any single data company, you're going to be in a better position than if you do.
I would even take that one step further. As we saw in the MLB case study, that success there was based on your own data, your first-party data that they got from their own site, and then they leveraged Quantcast to have success. I wouldn't even rely on my own first-party data solely and then model it out. I think it's important to model my first-party data, which is all new hotness right now, against third-party data, which we don't like, and other data sources to really say, how do we not only retarget cleverly, but how do we prospect, how do we cast the net wider, and is my first-party data even accurate? Are the people who are walking into my brick and mortars the same people on my website? Am I tracking them properly? And double check myself before I go spending tons of money against something that might not be wholly correct.
I think we're pretty much out of time, right? Can I go to the audience for a question? Yeah? Anyone have any questions? I want to do more audience participation, but these guys talk too much. I'm sorry about that. Over in the back. Can you identify who you are and where you're from and before you give your question?
Sure. My name's Kim. I'm from Converge Direct Agency. So I had a question about just DSPs in general. Do you think they'll become more transparent? Because when we pull DSP reporting, when we do buys, a lot of times it'll show up with a large majority of the impressions just say like Microsoft Ad Exchange, or it'll say AdMeld, or you don't actually see the sites. Do you think that's a problem with the DSP, or is it a problem across all DSPs right now?
I would say it's a publisher issue more than anything, or an exchange issue. As the industry continues to grow, and we've talked about it even this morning's session when we talked about the growth, and we're seeing more and more impressions and more people invest. Once publishers are seeing that major advertisers, major branding advertisers are really using this space as a majority or a large chunk of their media buys, that's going to slowly dwindle away. Once they start to realize that it's a major spot for players, they're going to start to realize that it's just as equal of a buy cycle as the direct side.
Yeah, I think it's evolution of the space. So direct answer to your question, I think they all suck at that, and I think it's just the evolution of the space. However, history, and I keep saying this over and over, but history does repeat itself. I was working in this business before there were third-party ad servers. I remember in the day when my first client came to me and said, I want a third-party ad server this, and I had to go to my boss and be like, Diet Coke wants a third-party ad service, and he's like, they want a fucking what? Right? And we're like extrapolating log files, and early days of AdSense, right? I couldn't separate my AdSense reporting from AdWords, and then I could separate that, but then they wouldn't let me separate publishers within AdSense. Facebook wouldn't let you track anything, and then last week they come out with conversion tracking. So I think that's just a byproduct of the space. I think it is some of the publishers. I think it is some technology problems within that, and I think as the industry grows and matures, that option and that transparency will just happen.
Well, and the other question too is what are you trying to get out of that report, which is to say, okay, hey, I get to see that all of my inventory is on YouTube. Well, okay, YouTube is a ginormous channel, so to say that, okay, let me now allocate all of my media toward YouTube is also equally insane, because you don't know, there's too much volume there. So even you have these scale problems and scale opportunities, but by saying, oh, I've suddenly realized that 80% of my impressions were delivered to YouTube, that doesn't mean 100% of them should be, because there's still different elements within that, again, time of day that may be better or worse, and you can't hand manipulate those.
Another question?
No, I think it's a problem when you're trying to explain to your clients and extrapolate learnings from it, and they're asking you where they're running, and you have such a large percent of impressions serving blind, like you would with a blind ad network, but you promise them transparency with DSP, and then you don't get that transparency.
Well, there's your problem right there. I mean, if you're running in an RTB space and you promise them transparency, you sort of set yourself up to fail.
The DSPs come in and pitch transparency, which doesn't wind up being the case.
Yeah. I had another question there. Yes. Name and where you're from?
Hi, Jeff Murphy with Adconian Direct. Quick question. What do we need to do to get from viewable or view-through conversions to viewable impression view-through conversions, which obviously would be an enormous step towards eliminating the cookie bombing problem that Anne was talking about?
Visual IQ merges with, no, I don't know, Adometry decides to have a baby with ComScore and comes up with some solution.
And can you do better than that,
conversion.
please?
Yeah, we are not necessarily in the baby making business, but I think that, I mean, it's the same thing you do with regular conversions, right? You got to get the pixel on, and then you need to be working with a technology that can do viewable. And then if those two are tied together, one of the problems that kind of prevents this is that people are doing measurement of what is the quality of my audience in one system, what am I getting viewable impressions in another system, what is my conversions in another system, and as you've said, like having them all in different systems is problematic, and is that system independent? So as it comes down to a single tag and then adding a conversion tag, you will be able to do that. And we're starting to do that right now, focused not necessarily on the DR conversion first, but we actually focused on the brand lift and measuring the viewable brand lift first, and are then looking at actual DR conversion.
I'm just obsessing over the fact that you just said get your pixel on. I like that.
All right.
But I think what Joel said, though, at the very start of this panel is let's not forget it. KPI yields value to whatever advertiser you work with. And if you have a rational conversation about KPI, and you're hitting that KPI, then there are other things that you may or may not choose to focus on. So like we encourage our clients, and my friend over here is one of them, we encourage our clients to think of, again, if they're an agency, think about strategy, audience, message, creative, all the other things you can optimize that you're probably not doing an ultimate job of optimizing if you're meeting KPIs. It's when you're not meeting a KPI, that's when you have to start building or extrapolating through the layers of the stack to figure out which stack signal is the one that's the right signal to.
It's totally like sports, right? Everything's fine when you're winning.
So I've been told I got to wrap it up. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all for listening.
Fantastic. And we're all around if you want to ask